America is home to some of the best universities in the world. From the East Coast to the West Coast, the country is littered with centers of learning that has produced some of the best minds in history. Sri Lankan students hoping to study in the United States have several hurdles to overcome. You have to first get accepted, find the finances, get the visa, and then adapt to the culture and learn to live and study without your immediate support system. Tonight's episode of Global Perspectives is especially for students. We'll be talking about how to select the best university for you, including options you may not have heard of before, and how to prepare your applications. We'll also be talking with a visa officer from the American Embassy, someone you could be seeing during your visa interview. He'll share some advice on increasing your chances of getting a visa. That's what's ahead on this week's Global Perspectives. Good evening and welcome once again to another edition of Global Perspectives. This show is almost exclusively for students who are looking to go abroad for their higher education, and tonight we're focusing on educational opportunities in the United States. July is the beginning of the university application season, so for all of you out there hoping to apply to an American university, we thought we'd bring you some inside information to hopefully help you with your applications. In this segment, we take a look at application process, what does it take to get admitted to a U.S. university, how will you finance your education, and what can you do to better your chances of getting a visa. Here's Madhushka Balasurya from the News First International Desk.
Every year, thousands of Sri Lankan students apply to US universities, and this year's rush has already begun.
How many students do you think a year from Sri Lanka apply for an opportunity to study in the States?
It's difficult for me to estimate now, but there are a few thousand every year. And as I was mentioning, June, July, and August are really the heaviest months in terms of the number of student applicants. So we're seeing many right now.
Students who have already been accepted to universities are now applying for their visas to travel to the States by August or September, when the first semesters usually begin. Students hoping to start their education next year must start preparing applications now. Preparing the college application is a tedious process. It could make or break your dreams, which is why the most important piece of advice admissions officers will give students is not to rush applications and start preparing your applications months ahead of the deadline. For international students, US university applications will always include at least 5 basic requirements. The first is your school transcripts. You must obtain official transcripts, and if they're in Sinhala or Tamil, they must be translated to English. The second requirement is your knowledge of the English language. Both undergraduate and graduate students will almost always have to take the TOEFL exam. Universities will have various requirements of the acceptable range of marks. Undergraduate students must also take either the SAT or the ACT exams. At least one of these standardized tests is usually a requirement for admissions. Another difficult part of the application is the dreaded essay. Students will have to write one or more essays as a part of their college application. The essays have 2 basic functions: to test your intellect away from your grades and to see your character. The essays are the only chance students will have to show admissions officers what kind of person they are. And finally, all students will have to prove that they can afford the university's tuition. If you are in need of financial assistance, make sure the school offers financial aid for international students before you start the application process. Also check other organizations and foundations for financial assistance. Oftentimes, students will have to submit entirely different applications for scholarships and grants, and sometimes with different deadlines. So early planning is the key. Students are often terrified of the visa process, mostly because they don't know what to expect. So Global Perspectives decided to go directly to the source. Douglas Ostertag is a visa counselor at the US Embassy in Colombo. He interviews hundreds of students and makes decisions on their visa applications. Ostertag says that students have to convince visa officers of 3 key things: whether you're a credible student, whether you have the ability to pay, and whether you intend on returning to Sri Lanka after your studies.
There's a huge demand of Sri Lankan students who are eager to pursue education in the United States. But at the same time, there may not be enough knowledge about the process and what they need to do in order to qualify for a visa. So would you enlighten us on how the process works and what are the main stages that they need to be aware of?
Okay, well, essentially each consular officer looks at 3 elements. One is the ability to actually pay for the studies in the United States. The second is whether an applicant is a credible student, whether they've actually studied and have prepared for the coursework in the United States. And the third is their intent to return to Sri Lanka after their graduation. And really, each applicant has roughly 2 to 5 minutes to speak to a consular officer and to demonstrate each of these three elements. And essentially, if they prepare well enough in advance, it should be a relatively easy process.
Now, you said something about evidence. They need to prove these areas. Now, what are certain significant ways of proving your academic ability, your financial stability, and then also the fact that you are considering coming back to the country? What are certain documents that would really please you as somebody interviewing a student?
Sure. There are actually very, very few required documents, but essentially to establish that you're a credible student, we would often want to take a look at your academic transcripts, any academic records. Okay? Those are the elements that would really examine to see whether you were a credible student from our eyes. The second element is whether you have the financial means to actually pay for the studies in the United States. Now, each applicant, once they've been accepted to a university, that university will provide them with the actual estimated costs. Okay? And once an officer is able to identify those costs, then we request documents that would essentially show that the student would have access to those funds. Often, students bring in bank records. Those are the most common type of record that students do bring in. And essentially, we try to encourage these student applicants to bring in bank records that indicate at least that these funds have remained in this bank account for at least 6 months. We want to look at a transaction history. And then in terms of the actual intent to return to Sri Lanka, does this course of study actually make sense for this student? And have they actually considered what exactly they will do in Sri Lanka upon graduation?
Another major concern for students is their fluency in English, particularly for those who have studied in the vernacular languages. Some knowledge of English will be necessary since the medium of instruction will be English. However, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Another restriction for many students outside Colombo to even consider or even have to dream of the opportunity of education abroad is the limited knowledge of English at times. How do you judge one's ability to communicate in English or to actually study in English? And is that a very important requirement?
Often, when a student has been accepted into a university or college in the United States, a form called the Form I-20 is issued to the student, and essentially set forth next to the tuition costs is whether the instruction will be in English or English as a second language. Now, if the course of instruction will be administered in English, then essentially that interview will be conducted in English, and the officer will be assessing whether that student actually has the ability to carry on at a university level. However, oftentimes applicants don't have a full command of the English language, and it is not required so long as that Form I-20 says that the student will be studying English as a second language for perhaps 1, 2 to 3 to 4 months prior to actually matriculating to the 4-year degree in the United States. So based on what that information says on the Form I-20 and the course of study that the student has been authorized to enter, the officer will kind of gauge at what level the English should be, if at all.
Getting an American education can be very expensive, and reports indicate that the cost of higher education is continuing to increase. For international students, those prices are even higher. But there are options that could make this investment more affordable. Many prominent universities practice a policy of need-blind admission and need-based financial aid. That means they will admit the student despite your financial status and provide financial assistance based on your need.
And so these are very clear indications of what they should do, and I'm sure that for some of the students who are watching out there, this helps them figure out how they should prepare for the interview. But for those who may not have the financial means to ever dream of an opportunity to study outside Sri Lanka, and especially in the United States, what are the opportunities that are available that they should be pursuing, and things that as a visa officer you would take as valid opportunities for them to enter the States as students?
Yeah, we regularly see students who wouldn't otherwise have adequate means to actually study in the United States, but there are so many opportunities for these students to search for available scholarships, tuition waivers, these sorts of things that many, many universities all throughout the United States actually do offer. In fact, here in Sri Lanka, there's the Fulbright Commission, and housed inside of this place are actual education advisors. And students in Sri Lanka can actually access this facility and speak with these advisors, who will then provide them with access to listings of scholarships and other types of financial aid that are available to international students. And I see this very, very regularly. In fact, this is June, and this is the start of the very heavy season in terms of student applicants here in Sri Lanka. And I've seen countless graduate students who are Sri Lankan traveling to the United States who have received full scholarship at their universities in the United States. So because you or your parents or your family don't necessarily have enough resources, it doesn't mean that the story ends there. You can certainly search for those resources, and a lot of it is essentially based on your academic achievement here in Sri Lanka.
And there's very many examples to prove that has been the case, and the United States has been gracious in creating opportunities like that. My next question is mainly when students, once again, from lesser affluent communities get the opportunity to go there because of a scholarship, how do they financially sustain themselves? And what are the requirements and the legal restrictions for employing themselves, like other students do in the States?
Well, essentially, most often the type of scholarships we do see cover both the tuition costs and the actual living costs. So that student will not be required or compelled in any way to actually seek out a job. Other times, some students do have interest in actually being employed on campus, and that is something that they do have an option to do so long as it's 20 hours or fewer every week when they're in a student status in terms of their visa, and the job itself has to relate to essential campus duties, and an authorized agent at the university has to authorize that particular job. Now, there are options to work off campus as well, also limited to the 20 hours per week, but essentially a campus official would have to assist the student in obtaining U.S. government authorization in order to work in that off-campus job.
Waiting for the university acceptance letter or email can be very stressful, but the visa interview is often the most nerve-wracking part of the entire process. Ostertag says the interview can be easy and quick if the student has taken the time to prepare.
So going back to the process of interviewing and so on and so forth, what are certain things as advice you would give to students, things that they should do and should not do when they're coming in to apply for a student visa?
No, it's essentially, I would highly encourage them just to simply be honest and to prepare for the process at least 4 to 5 weeks in advance. You know, these types of evidence that I was talking about, the financial records, the academic transcripts, these things do take some time to actually collect from various institutions, sometimes scattered out beyond Sri Lanka. And then I think that they need to basically ask themselves, why is it that they've selected this particular university in the United States and not Sri Lanka? Why have they selected this particular course of study? How does it really correspond to what they've studied here in Sri Lanka? I think if the student actually does consider these essential questions, I think the interview process will move much, much faster and much, much more easy, I think, in their perspective.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the option of community colleges. It may not be something Sri Lankan students are too familiar with, but it's an option that makes the American education much, much more affordable and flexible. You're watching Global Perspectives. We'll be right back after these commercial breaks.